They said it was for her purity, that the world was too loud, too filthy, too hungry for a soul like hers. So they took her, 6 years old, and sealed her behind stone walls. No trial, no choice, just silence, prayer, and the slow unraveling of a childhood-turned sacrifice. Imagine waking each morning not to sunlight, but to incense and whispers, to bells that toll not for life but for obedience. This is not a fable. This is not a legend. This is what they did to little girls. In the name of God, in the name of virtue, in the name of a salvation they themselves could not define. But behind those cold monastery doors, something began to break. She didn't understand why her mother didn't look back. The corridor was long, longer than anything her small legs had ever walked, and colder than the November wind outside. Her shoes made no sound on the worn stone floor. A nun walked ahead, silent, gliding, like some ghost from a story she hadn't yet heard, and behind her the heavy wooden door of the monastery shut with a sound that would echo through her bones for the rest of her life. 6 years old. Not old enough to know what chastity meant, not wise enough to grasp the word vocation, but old enough to feel that something had ended, that the world, with its unpredictable noise, its unpredictable love, had closed like a mouth behind her. And now, only silence and rules. The monastery wasn't a place. It was a punishment wrapped in piety, a still world inside a turning one. Outside, men fought wars. Kings died. Empires collapsed under the weight of their ambition. But inside these walls, time stood still, on purpose, as if to defy history itself, as if by holding still long enough one could purify the soul of the time's sins. She was placed in what they called the claustra, a narrow cell, hardly wider than her arms outstretched. A bed, a cross, a basin, no mirror, no books, just a window so high she couldn't see through it unless she climbed the wall. But even if she could, what use was the sky to a girl who was no longer allowed to dream? They told her God was watching, that every thought she had must be clean, that every twitch of a doubt, every ounce of hunger for the outside world, was a betrayal, not of the church, but of her own soul. They told her she was chosen, that the world's corruption would never touch her if she stayed impure, and that her purity would save others. But no one asked her if she wanted to be pure. No one told her what she was being saved from. She began to talk to herself. At first in whispers, then in silence. She invented people, faces, a sister who never left, a mother who returned, a God who listened. Her real God, not the distant punitive one in sermons, but one who sat with her in the dark and didn't demand anything in return. They gave her a name that wasn't hers. Sister Lucia. Her real name, what was it? Wasn't spoken again. It was as if the child she had been was not just gone, but forbidden. Her laughter, her questions, her fears, reclassified as sins to be confessed and cleansed. And yet, the darkness did not cleanse her. It changed her. As years passed, she noticed things. The cracks in the marble. The way the older nuns flinched when a certain priest entered the chapel. The way prayers were sometimes recited not with devotion, but with exhaustion, as if the words themselves were made of ash. She wasn't stupid. Isolation sharpens the mind in strange ways. Without distraction, the inner world becomes vast and dangerous. By 12, she knew that holiness could be a performance, that purity, when demanded, becomes its own form of corruption, that the soul could be imprisoned by those claiming to protect it. She began to write, illegally, scraps of parchment stolen, ink mixed from herbs and candle soot, not prayers, but questions, accusations, secrets. She buried them under floorboards, inside walls, between bricks behind the altar, little bombs of honesty waiting to explode long after she was gone. One day she asked a question aloud. If God is love, why am I so afraid? The room went silent, but not in the holy way. The other girls looked down. One of the nuns slapped her so hard her ear rang for days. She was forced to kneel for 6 hours, to repeat the same phrase 1,000 times. I am dust. I am nothing. I am the vessel of His will. But something inside her didn't break. It hardened. She began to watch not the rituals, but the people, the ones who led, the ones who obeyed, the subtle glances, the unspoken hierarchy, the cruel mercy of the Mother Superior. She saw that in the name of God people built thrones, and in the name of purity they justified cages. She started to test the boundaries. Small things. A missing candle, a skipped prayer, a question left unanswered. Each act a thread pulled from the tapestry. And still God did not strike her down. One night she climbed to the top of the chapel where the bell tower pierced the heavens. She looked out through the open slats and saw something she hadn't in years. Stars. Real, shimmering, merciless stars. Indifferent to her pain, indifferent to her piety. She wept, not from sadness but from recognition, because for the first time she felt something holy, not inside the chapel, but inside herself. They had locked her in to preserve her soul, but they had never asked what her soul truly was. And in that moment, surrounded by the cold wind and the unblinking cosmos, she began to understand. She was not a sacrifice. She was a witness, and her story had only begun. She was 16 when they asked her to take the veil. Not asked, required. A ceremony cloaked in beauty and symbol and ritual, but underneath it all, a quiet ultimatum. You are no longer a girl. You are the bride of Christ. You belong to no one else now. Not to a man, not to yourself, to God alone. The monastery bloomed in candlelight that day. The other sisters prepared her like a corpse before burial, washing her feet, brushing her hair, dressing her in white. She stood before the altar in silence, reciting the oath she was told to memorize. Her voice didn't tremble, not because she wasn't afraid, but because the fear had become so constant it had burned into a kind of calm, a dull, sacred numbness. As the veil was placed upon her head, her eyes drifted toward the crucifix above the altar. It looked different now, not like salvation, but like surrender, not like divine love, but something closer to punishment adorned in gold. She wondered if Christ had felt what she felt, that strange betrayal, not by enemies, but by the people who claimed to love him most. She wasn't sure anymore if this was faith, or if it was simply a life sentence with incense. They called her bride, but she didn't remember choosing the groom. The following years passed in a haze of obedience, prayer, labor, stillness. She became known as disciplined, devoted, pious. But inside, something was rotting. Not her belief. No, that had already collapsed like an old roof. What remained was performance, a hollow echo of ritual. She said the prayers, not to be close to God, but to stay invisible, to avoid suspicion, to survive. Because she had learned something. Holiness wasn't about closeness to the divine. It was about pleasing the watchers. She watched them, too. The confessor priest, with his roving eyes and sweet wine breath. The mother superior who punished the meek and praised the cruel. The young novice who disappeared for a week and returned with a silence stitched into her face like a wound. The rules bent for those who knew how to bend others. And the word of God became a tool not of redemption, but of control. One winter a new girl arrived. Her name was Katerina. She was only 10, eyes like fire under ice, and a mouth that didn't know how to stay shut. She spoke too much, laughed too often, and asked the questions no one dared utter aloud. Why do we wear black if God is light? Why are the stars forbidden if God made them? If silence is sacred, why does it feel like drowning? Lucia, if we still call her that, watched this girl closely. At first she tried to ignore her, to keep her distance. Attachment was dangerous, and yet, the more she watched, the more she remembered the child she had been, the one who asked, the one who wept under stars, the one they tried to erase with ritual and shame. So one night she broke the rules. She sat next to Katerina during the silent hour and whispered, "Never stop asking." Katerina looked at her with surprise, then something deeper. Trust. And for the first time in a decade, Lucia felt what it was to protect someone again, not through obedience, but through defiance. They began to meet in secret, just words, just questions, tiny exchanges in the corridor, a glance during prayer, and little by little the girl's fear lessened. Her fire didn't go out, it grew, and with it so did Lucia's. But fire cannot remain hidden forever. One morning Katerina was gone. They said she had lost her calling, that her soul was sick, that she was sent to a different place, a convent for those who needed stricter purification. Lucia knew what that meant. Punishment, isolation, re-education, and worse. That night she climbed again to the chapel bell tower, but the stars no longer felt holy. They were mocking now, cold and distant, like the God they claimed to serve. She did not cry. She did not pray. She decided. She would not let them do this again. Not to another girl. Not while she still had breath. So she began to write again. This time not in scraps, but in a book. A secret memoir, bound in cloth and hidden beneath the altar stones. She wrote everything. Names, dates, secrets. The truths no one dared speak. The fear, the abuse. The way holiness had become a costume and purity a weapon. She wrote not to confess, but to accuse. Not to find peace, but to reveal war. And as she wrote, the veil began to slip, not just from her head, but from her soul. She remembered her name, her real one, the one her mother whispered once. just before she turned and walked away. Anna. Not Lucia. Anna. The child who loves stories. The girl who once danced barefoot in fields. The daughter who was never meant to disappear into stone. The memory hit her like thunder. And in that moment she realized this had never been about saving her soul. It had been about silencing it. But her soul was not silent anymore. She began to leave signs. A word scribbled behind a loose stone, a ribbon slipped into a novice's pocket, a piece of bread left on a forbidden windowsill. She was building a map, not of escape, but of memory, so that one day, if someone came looking, they would know. Someone lived here, someone remembered. And someone resisted. But resistance cannot remain invisible forever. The Mother Superior found a page. Anna was summoned. The chapel was empty. Dark, lit only by a single candle. The air was thick as if holding its breath. "You have sinned," said the Mother, her voice calm, cold. "You have misled others. You have written things that do not belong to God." Hannah said nothing. "What you are doing," the woman continued, "is rebellion. And rebellion is the voice of the devil." Anna stepped forward, looked her in the eye. "No," she whispered. "Rebellion is the voice of the buried." The hand struck her cheek so hard she fell. They locked her in a chamber below the chapel. No light, no food, just water and silence. Days passed, or weeks. Time dissolved. But in that darkness she felt something she had never truly felt before. Not fear, not hope. Freedom, because the worst had happened, and she was still here. Because they had tried to break her, and had only revealed what could not be broken. Her name, her voice, her soul. Not pure, but real. And one day, that would be enough. Because truth, unlike obedience, doesn't require permission. They let her out when her body began to fail. Not from mercy, from necessity. It would not serve the monastery's reputation if a nun died beneath its floors. And so they opened the door, not to free her, but to parade her repentance, to display her as a cautionary tale. Look what happens to the proud, to the disobedient, to those who think they can speak to God without an intermediary. She could barely walk, her limbs thin as reeds, her skin pale as parchment, but her eyes had changed. The fear was gone. What remained was something far more dangerous. Knowledge, not of doctrine, but of people, of systems, of the machinery that called itself sacred. They dressed her in white again, paraded her in silence through the chapel. A resurrection, but backwards. Not of Christ, but of control. And all around her the sisters lowered their gaze. Not from reverence, from recognition. They saw what she was. Not a fallen nun. A mirror. She was 20 now. Young by the world's measure, ancient by the monastery's. The confessor came to speak with her that evening. Alone. Of course. His words were sweetened with concern. His hand lingered too long on hers. He spoke of second chances, of redemption, of obedience as a form of love. She said nothing, but the next morning his door bore a mark. 3 lines, scratched into the wood. He left a week later. No one spoke of why. They called her dangerous now. But not aloud, not in official terms. In glances, in silences, in the sudden stillness that followed her steps. They couldn't expel her. That would mean admitting they had failed, that one of their purest had turned. So instead they did what institutions always do with inconvenient truths. They buried her, in plain sight. Gave her the coldest cell, the dullest tasks, scrubbing floors, washing the latrines, removing her from the choir, banning her from letters. She was to be seen but not heard, alive but erased. But what they didn't understand was this. When you have nothing left to lose, silence becomes a weapon. She began to teach again, not with words, with glances, with pauses, with the way she held herself. The other novices saw it, the quiet defiance, the unspoken flame. And slowly they began to shift. Little rebellions, a skipped prayer, a question asked with too much boldness, a refusal to bow quite as deeply. She wasn't alone anymore. Her legend grew. A whisper passed from cell to cell. Some called her a heretic. Others, though they would never admit it aloud, called her a saint. The girl who burned in silence, but never went out. The one who remembered what her name was. And then, like all stories wrapped in fear and myth, something strange began to happen. Pilgrims came, not because of her, not yet, but drawn by a rumor. A monastery where something holy and terrifying was happening. A place where the divine had begun to stir, not in gold or incense, but in the eyes of a single woman who no longer flinched. The church took notice. A bishop arrived unannounced. with guards, with scribes, with questions. He met with Anna in private. They say the meeting lasted 2 hours. No one knows what was said, but when the door opened, the bishop's face was pale, and Anna's was calm. The next day, the monastery received a letter from Rome. No one ever saw the contents, but within a month, the Mother Superior was replaced. The rules changed. Not loudly, not drastically, but enough. The youngest girls were no longer cloistered. Education was introduced, and Anna, quietly, without ceremony, was made mistress of novices. She never celebrated. She never took revenge. She simply watched, and taught, and remembered, because she knew that victory in places like this doesn't come with applause. It comes with survival. Years passed. The walls remained the same, but something had shifted beneath them. The prayers sounded different now, less like pleading, more like breathing. The girls no longer looked down as they walked. And Anna, she became what they had always feared, a woman of faith, but not of submission. Her book, the one she wrote in secret, was never found, at least not officially. But decades later, long after her death, a parchment was discovered behind the altar. Faded, fragile, but still legible. The first line read, "They tried to make me pure, but I was already whole." No signature, but they knew whose hand had written it. And somewhere far beyond the monastery's reach, a girl reads those words and begins to ask her first forbidden question. She'd never been free, not in the way the world defines it, with open roads, choices, lovers, mistakes. Her freedom was stranger, more dangerous. It lived in silence, behind her eyes. It spoke in her refusal to flinch. It burned quietly like a hidden ember inside stone. They thought they had reformed her. That obedience had been achieved not through force, but grace. They paraded her now. Mother Anna, dignified, stoic, a relic polished into usefulness. Young girls looked at her and saw safety, order, devotion. But beneath the folds of her habit, under the brittle discipline of ritual, she carried every scar, not with shame, but with intent. Because some souls do not shatter. They harden into mirrors, and when they are forced to kneel long enough, they learn to rise so slowly that no one sees them standing. Her influence grew not through speech, but presence. She rarely raised her voice. She never preached. But when she entered a room, it changed. Time seemed to slow. Even the air became heavier. Her silence wasn't absence. It was pressure. And it pressed on everything false. The girls came to her with questions. Always softly. Always after dark. One by one they unfolded themselves in her presence. Not because she promised safety, but because she promised truth. Why do I feel God more when I disobey? Why does devotion feel like erasure? Why am I told to love a world that never loved me? She never answered directly. She asked better questions. She gave them riddles, parables, wounds disguised as wisdom. She led them to the edge of thought and made them look down. Some turned away. Some wept. Some stepped off and discovered wings. But the church does not forgive too much truth. Not for long. Not from a woman. Not when that woman begins to be followed. Rome had tolerated her transformation because it was useful. A symbol of penance. A mark of spiritual victory. But now rumors spread. That girls no longer feared punishment. That obedience had become choice. That some novices were beginning to speak of a different kind of holiness. One that was not given, but discovered. They called it pride. They called it corruption. They sent letters. Then warnings. Then watchers. A young priest arrived under the guise of a spiritual advisor. Handsome, charismatic, eyes too polished, smile too perfect. He asked questions with feigned humility, listened with rehearsed awe, and Anna knew instantly what he was, a knife sent to test the wound. He requested private conversations. She declined. He called it rebellion. She called it clarity. He wrote reports. She wrote silence. But power cannot coexist with mystery. One day, after Mass, he stood before the sisters and read a decree from Rome. It was official. Anna was to be relocated. Promoted, they said, elevated, a position of guidance in a distant convent. But she heard the real sentence. Exile. They were removing the fire before it spread. She did not argue. She simply stood, nodded once, and left. The carriage took her through landscapes she hadn't seen in decades. Trees, fields, children, and color. And the sound, so much sound. The world, chaotic and ugly and alive. Her hands trembled in her lap, not from fear, but from remembering. Remembering what it meant to exist without permission. The new convent was quiet. Too quiet. The sisters there had already been warned. They welcomed her with forced smiles and suspicious eyes. She was placed in a room that overlooked nothing. No garden, no sky, just wall. They gave her no novices to guide, no duties, just prayer and stillness, as if she could be absorbed into silence once more. But silence to Anna had never been absence. It was space. Space to watch, to listen, to wait. And she waited, because she knew this wasn't the end. It was a seed, and seeds only look like silence to the impatient. She began again. Small gestures. A conversation by the well. A glance during evening prayer. A book left open to the right page. And the younger sisters began to ask, whisper, shift. Because the truth once tasted cannot be untasted. Even exile cannot erase it. And Rome knew. They knew she could not be stopped, only buried. So they offered her one final act of mercy. Retirement. To a hermitage in the hills. Alone. With God. She accepted. Not because she was broken, but because she was done planting in other people's gardens. It was time to tend her own. The path to the hermitage wound through ancient woods, every step a shedding of stone, of rules, of names. She reached the little cell at sunset, and for the first time in years opened a door with her own hands. No guards, no altar, just wind. She lit no candles. She made no sign of the cross. She sat, and the stars came out. She did not pray. She remembered. Every girl, every silence, every name. And then she did what they had always feared most. She began to write again, this time not in secret, not in fear, but as a testament, not of her holiness, but of her humanity. A life carved from obedience, but rooted in resistance. A soul they could not purify, because it had never been dirty, only unbowed, only real. And when her body finally failed years later, they found her at the desk, quill in hand, eyes open, smiling. A single line scrawled on the parchment. Holiness was never their gift to give. The monastery remembered her, not with statues, not with hymns, but with unease. Her name was forbidden in the archives. Her writings disappeared into fire. Her teachings diluted into doctrine so watered down it left no trace of her voice. Officially she was recorded as obedient, modest, retiring, a quiet servant of God. But buildings remember, stone remembers. And the chapel she had once scrubbed with bleeding hands. It began to breathe differently. The silence inside no longer felt holy, it felt haunted. Girls spoke of dreams, of a figure walking between the pews at night, not in white like the Virgin, not in black like the nuns, but in gray, the color of dust, of ash, of something burned but not destroyed. They said she stood behind them during prayer, that when they wept in secret they felt a hand, not comforting but steady, on their shoulder. The elders dismissed it. Superstition. But the Mother Superior, young, newly appointed, eager to climb, grew nervous. She sensed it, too, that tremor under the rituals, that slippage of order. And more than once she found notes tucked into psalms, lines from no scripture she had ever learned. God speaks loudest through those you silence. Obedience is not faith, it is fear in robes. Ask, and you will be punished. Ask again, and you will be changed. She burned the notes, but they returned, because Anna had not written her story to be preserved. She had written it to be found. One of the youngest girls, Elena, began to change. She had been quiet, pale, proper. Now her gaze lingered too long. Now her prayers were spoken too slowly. Now her questions cut too deep. She asked the unaskable, why does God need me to disappear to love me? And when silence met her question, she didn't back down. She wrote the line in chalk on her wall, and others followed. The convent was breathing again, not with piety, but with rebellion wrapped in reverence, because Anna's story had not ended with her death. It had become myth, but not the kind gilded by saints, the kind whispered in corners, the kind that moves like smoke through cracks in marble. Elena found the last page, hidden behind a loose stone in the library wall, folded, faded, but still alive. It read, if they ever tell you God needs your silence, remember, He spoke the world into being. Elena didn't cry. She stood up, and for the first time in her short life she walked into the chapel, not to confess, but to remember, to reclaim, to continue. That night she sat by candlelight and began to write, not to obey, to witness, to burn, because faith, real faith, doesn't kneel. It stands. It speaks. It survives. They built walls thinking they could hold her, but they forgot. Souls do not rot the way flesh does. A body can be bound. a tongue silenced, a name erased, but a truth that's lived through fire cannot be unlearned. It seeps, it haunts, it infects, not with terror, but with recognition. And that is what they feared most, not rebellion, not heresy, recognition. Because when a single girl sees herself in the face of a woman who dared to stay human inside the machine, the whole order trembles. Authority does not collapse through violence. It collapses through empathy. Years passed. The convent changed names. The rules softened. New uniforms, modern theology, electricity, running water. But the bones of the place, unchanged, still cold, still rigid, still pretending to serve a god whose voice had long since grown quiet within its walls. The nuns who had buried Anna's story grew old, then gone, and a new generation took their place. More educated, more cautious, but still afraid to speak aloud what the stones already knew. Elena never became Mother Superior. She left, not in disgrace, in certainty. She carried only a satchel, a few notes, a single page written in a hand long dead. She never told the others. She just walked out of the gate one morning and didn't return. Some said she lost her faith. Others said she found it. No one knew where she went. But 10 years later, a manuscript appeared in a quiet bookstore in Florence. No author, no publisher, just a leather-bound book with a single embossed word. Ashes. It spread like smoke. Quiet. Patient. Into hands that were ready to read between the lines. It wasn't just the story of Anna. It was the story of 1,000 girls, locked away in the name of virtue, burned at the altar of purity, made to believe their silence was salvation. It was a hymn for the unspoken, a gospel for the exiled. Rome ignored it at first, then condemned it, called it blasphemy, but it was too late. Because when women read it, they remembered, not just Anna, themselves. And that was the revolution, not fire, not blood, but memory. A remembering so powerful it unstitched centuries of forgetting. In time, the monastery became a museum. Visitors walked its corridors in reverent silence, unsure of what exactly they were meant to feel. The tour guides told the safe version. A holy woman, misunderstood. A tale of humility, resilience, inspiration. They left out the bruises, the hunger, the stolen name. But sometimes, when no one was looking, a girl would linger. She'd pause by a narrow cell, run her fingers along the cold stone, close her eyes, and hear it. Not words, not sound, but presence. The kind that reminds you you're not alone. The kind that survives. The kind that once wrote in the dark, I am not holy, I am whole. And somewhere in a world that still builds cages and calls them sacred, that sentence becomes a key. Not to escape. To awaken. Because Anna was never trying to escape. She was trying to live. And the last thing she confessed was not her sin, but her refusal to vanish. They locked her away at 6 years old, but the door never stayed shut. Not really, because when truth lives long enough in silence, it stops asking to be heard, and starts demanding to be felt. And somewhere far beyond the walls, a voice the world tried to bury still whispered from beneath the stones. Holiness was never their gift to give.